I had spent 3 days making that dinner perfect. Not because I needed anyone's approval, I had long stopped needing that, but because I genuinely believed, with the kind of stubborn, almost embarrassing faith that only a woman who has loved someone for 14 years can have, that this anniversary dinner would be different. That this year, something would shift. That Daniel would look at me across the table, over the candles I had placed just so, beside the flowers I had cut from our own garden, and remember what we had built together. Remember me. I had chosen the menu carefully. Herb-crusted lamb, because it was his favorite. Roasted root vegetables with rosemary, because they filled the house with a smell that always made him soften. A chocolate torte, because 14 years ago he had fed me a slice of one on our first proper date and called me the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. I had dressed in the burgundy wrap dress I knew he liked. I had even worn the perfume, the one from the little glass bottle he had brought back from a conference in Paris 4 years ago, the one I saved for special occasions, because I was always afraid of using it up. I wanted everything to be right. I wanted to believe that right was still possible. Our house was a wide, cream-colored Victorian on Haverford Lane, with tall sash windows and a garden that backed onto a quiet stretch of woodland. We had bought it together 11 years ago, shortly after our daughter Lily was born, and I had spent the better part of a decade making it into something beautiful. The hallway had original parquet flooring that I had stripped and polished myself. The kitchen, where I stood that Saturday afternoon, stirring a sauce and listening to the radio, had cream-painted cabinets and an old farmhouse table that seated 10 comfortably. I loved that table. I had found it at an estate sale in Wiltshire and driven it home strapped to the roof of our estate car, laughing the entire way because Daniel had been absolutely certain it wouldn't fit. It fit. That was the thing about me and Daniel back then. Things always seemed to fit. We argued, yes, all couples argue, but there had been a time, a long, warm stretch of years, when we had understood each other in the effortless way that people do when they have genuinely chosen one another. He was an architect. I ran a small but respected interior design consultancy from a studio I rented above a florist shop in the village. We had Lily, who was 13 and sharp and funny and far too perceptive for her own good. We had Sunday mornings and long walks and a shared shorthand that felt for years like the most intimate language in the world. I don't know exactly when it stopped feeling that way. I know it didn't happen overnight. It happened the way water carves stone, slowly, invisibly, until one day you realize the whole landscape has changed and you can't remember what it looked like before. The guests were arriving at 7. I had invited 12 people. Daniel's mother, Gloria, and his younger sister, Petra, who had driven down from Edinburgh, my closest friend, Renata, and her husband, Tom, our neighbors, the Caldwells, Daniel's colleague, Marcus, who I had always liked, and a handful of others, people who had been present at various chapters of our life together. It was meant to be a celebration, 14 years. I had even had small cards printed with the date and a line from the poem Daniel had read at our wedding. In this life, I was loved by you. I had placed one at every setting. Gloria arrived first, as she always did. She was a tall, angular woman in her late 60s, with silver hair she wore in a severe chignon, and a way of entering a room that suggested she considered it already hers. She had never been warm to me. Not openly hostile, not in any way I could have pointed to and said, "There, that is the problem." But there was always something underneath her politeness, something watchful and proprietary, as though she were perpetually assessing the gap between what I was and what her son deserved. She kissed me on both cheeks, handed me a bottle of wine I had not asked for, and walked straight past me into the kitchen, where she stood and looked at everything I had prepared with the particular expression of a woman who is deciding whether to be impressed. "You've gone to a lot of trouble," she said. It was not quite a compliment. "It's our anniversary," I said pleasantly. "I wanted it to be special." She picked up one of the little printed cards from the counter, I hadn't set the table yet, and read the line of poetry. Something crossed her face. It was gone in an instant, but I saw it. A flicker of something tight and satisfied, like a person who has just confirmed a suspicion. I didn't understand it then. I filed it away the way you file things that don't quite make sense, and went back to my sauce. Daniel came downstairs at 6:45. He was freshly showered, wearing the gray linen shirt I had bought him for his birthday, and he looked— I remember this clearly because I remember everything about that evening with the horrible precision of someone who has replayed it too many times. He looked like a man who had already made a decision. Not nervous, not guilty, resolved. There is a particular quality to a person who has chosen their course of action and is simply waiting for the moment to execute it. And if I had been less busy, less hopeful, less focused on making everything perfect, I might have recognized it sooner. "You look nice," he said. "Thank you." I handed him a glass of wine. "Your mother's already in the sitting room." He nodded and went to find her, and through the serving hatch between the kitchen and the hall I saw them, just for a moment before Renata arrived and I went to answer the door, standing close together, speaking quietly. Gloria had her hand on Daniel's arm. He was listening with his head slightly bowed. When he looked up, he was not looking at her. He was looking at the wall above the mantelpiece, where our wedding photograph hung in a wide silver frame. I should have known then. I didn't. By 7:30, everyone was seated around the farmhouse table. I had lit the candles, the lamb was resting under foil, the wine had been poured. It looked, from the outside, and I am certain it did look this way because Renata told me later that it had been one of the most beautiful dinner tables she had ever sat at, like the kind of evening that people remember fondly for years. The warm light, the good food, the gathering of people who mattered. Lily was at the table too. I had considered whether to let her join. 13 felt young for an adult dinner party. But she had asked so earnestly, and she looked so grown up in her pale blue dress with her dark hair pinned back, that I had relented. She sat between Marcus and Petra, and she was laughing at something Marcus had said, and I remember thinking, look at her, she's becoming someone remarkable. I felt, in that moment, a surge of pure love, the uncomplicated kind, the kind that has nothing to do with any other person on earth. That was the last uncomplicated feeling I had that evening. The starter had been cleared, the lamb was on the table, glasses had been refilled. Daniel stood up. I assumed he was going to give a toast. It was something he had done every year, a small tradition, a few words about the year we'd had and the years ahead. I smiled up at him. I was still wearing the smile when he picked up his glass, looked around the table at each face in turn, and opened his mouth. "I want to say something," he said. His voice was steady, calm, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this. Something important, and I want to say it here, in front of the people who matter to us, because I believe in honesty. Renata, beside me, shifted slightly. I felt rather than saw her turn to look at me. "Clara and I are getting divorced." The room did not go silent immediately. There was a half second, a strange, suspended fragment of time, during which the candle flames continued to flicker, and Marcus's fork was halfway to his mouth, and somewhere outside a car went past on the lane. Then the silence fell, and it was absolute. "I've met someone," Daniel continued. "Her name is Sophie. She's 29, and she's pregnant." I was looking at my plate. I don't know why. I was looking at the slice of lamb on my plate, at the little pool of sauce beside it, at the sprig of rosemary I had placed there, and I was thinking, with a clarity that surprised me given the circumstances, I chose that rosemary from the garden this morning. I cut it with the small scissors I keep in the kitchen drawer. I was humming something when I did it. I can't remember what. Then I heard it. Laughter. Not uncomfortable laughter. Not the nervous, reflexive kind that sometimes escapes people in shocking situations. Real laughter, light and unguarded, the laughter of someone who has been waiting for good news and has finally received it. I looked up. Gloria had her hand pressed to her mouth, but her eyes were bright and dancing. And Lily, my 13-year-old daughter in her pale blue dress, was grinning. Not a confused grin, not a "this is very awkward" grin, a delighted one. That was the moment the ground went out from under me. Not when Daniel spoke, not when he said the woman's name or her age or the word pregnant. The moment the world shifted on its axis was when I looked at my daughter's face and understood that she had known. She had known before tonight. She had known, and she had said nothing, and she was glad. I set down my fork. I smoothed the napkin in my lap. I looked at Daniel, then at Gloria, then at Lily. My voice when it came was perfectly level. It was the voice of someone standing at the center of something enormous and choosing, very deliberately, not to be swept away by it. "All right then," I said quietly. I let the silence hold for one full breath. "Brace yourselves." Nobody laughed after that. Nobody asked me what I meant. That was the thing that struck me later, in the long, sleepless hours after everyone had gone home. Nobody at that table asked me to explain myself. Not Daniel, who was still standing with his glass raised like a man who had expected applause and received something else entirely. Not Gloria, whose bright, dancing eyes had gone very still the moment I spoke. Not even Renata, who knew me better than almost anyone alive. They all just sat there, in the warm candlelight, in the wreckage of the evening I had spent 3 days building, and they were quiet, because they understood the tone. People always understand the tone, even when they pretend otherwise. I stood up from the table with the unhurried movement of someone who has simply decided that this particular chapter of the evening is over. I picked up my wine glass, walked to the kitchen, set it on the counter beside the sink, and stood there for a moment looking out through the dark window at the garden. The woodland beyond the fence was invisible at this hour, just a wall of black, but I had looked at it so many times that I could see it anyway. The oak at the far left, the silver birch in the middle, the path that Lily and I used to walk on Sunday mornings when she was small, before she became the kind of 13-year-old who knew her father's secrets and kept them. I heard Renata come into the kitchen behind me. I heard the soft sound of her setting something down on the counter, her own glass, or perhaps a stack of plates, the instinctive hospitality of a woman who tidies when she doesn't know what else to do. Then her hand on my shoulder, warm and firm. "Clara," she said. "I'm fine," I said. "You don't have to be." "I know," I turned around, "but I am, or I will be, which amounts to the same thing right now." She looked at me for a long moment. Renata had known me since university, 20 years, give or take. She had been at our wedding. She had held Lily in the hospital the day she was born and cried in a way that Daniel and I had teased her about for years. She knew my face better than most people knew their own. Whatever she saw in mine that night made her nod, slowly, and say nothing more. In the dining room, I could hear the low murmur of voices resuming, the awkward, effortful small talk of people trying to reassemble a social occasion from its ruins. I heard Daniel's voice, steadier than I would have liked. I heard Gloria's, lighter than it had been all evening, the voice of a woman who has been holding something in for a long time and has at last been permitted to exhale. I heard the Caldwells making polite excuses to leave, which they did within 10 minutes, collecting their coats with the swift efficiency of people who want no part of whatever is coming next. Marcus left shortly after them. He paused in the kitchen doorway and looked at me with an expression I would not fully understand until much later. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I had no idea." I thanked him. I meant it. He left. By 9 o'clock, the table held only 5 people: Daniel, Gloria, Petra, Renata, and me. Tom had taken their car and gone home when Renata made clear she was staying. Lily had disappeared upstairs at some point during the exodus, and I had let her go. What I had to say to my daughter was not something that could be said in front of an audience. It would wait. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his usual place, with his hands wrapped around his wine glass and the particular expression of a man who believes that having said a difficult thing out loud is equivalent to having dealt with it. He had the look of someone who expected the hardest part to be over. I sat down across from him, folded my hands on the table, and looked at him steadily. "How long?" I said. He met my eyes. "Clara." "How long, Daniel?" A pause. 18 months. 18 months. I let that number sit in the room. 18 months ago, Lily had been 11. 18 months ago, I had been in this kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday evening, making pasta and listening to the radio, and Daniel had been... where? With Sophie, whoever Sophie was. Wherever they went, whatever they said to each other, whatever version of himself he had decided he preferred when he was with her. 18 months ago, I had bought him a birthday gift, a beautiful drafting set in a leather case, because he had mentioned in passing that his old one was worn out, and he had kissed me and said, "You always know exactly what I need." And then, presumably, he had gone back to his other life. "And the baby," I said, "how far along?" 4 months. So she was showing, or nearly, which meant people knew, his colleagues probably, friends of hers, and how many of those people had looked at me when we passed in some social setting I was no longer accurately remembering, and known. How many had smiled and said, "Oh, Daniel's wife, lovely to meet you," while knowing perfectly well that Daniel's wife was the last to be informed. "Who else knew?" I asked. He said nothing, which was its own answer. I looked at Gloria. She held my gaze with the unblinking steadiness of a woman who has decided that the time for pretense is behind her. There was no guilt in her face. There was something almost like relief. And beneath the relief, carefully arranged but not quite concealed, something that looked a great deal like triumph. "Of course," I said. "Clara," Gloria said, in the tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. "Daniel came to me because he needed someone to talk to. He's my son. What was I supposed to do? Turn him away?" "I'm not asking what you were supposed to do," I said. "I'm asking what you did. And what you did was keep his secret for 18 months while sitting at this table, while calling me on my birthday, while asking me last Christmas whether Daniel and I had thought about renewing our vows. The last one landed. Even Gloria blinked. "You asked me that," I said, and my voice was very, very calm. "You sat in that chair, that exact chair, on Christmas Day, and you asked me whether we had ever considered renewing our vows, while knowing your son was 4 months into an affair." I tilted my head slightly. "I've been trying to understand that. Was it cruelty? Entertainment? Or were you simply so certain this moment was coming that you wanted to watch my face when I still believed?" The room was absolutely silent. Gloria opened her mouth, closed it. Petra, beside her, was looking at the table. Daniel said, "That's not fair." "What part of tonight has been fair?" I asked him, pleasantly. He had no answer for that. I refilled my wine glass, steady hands, I noted with a remote kind of satisfaction, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The chocolate torte was still in the kitchen, untouched. I had spent 2 hours making it, and it occurred to me with a sudden crystalline clarity that I was not going to serve it. Let it sit there. Let it be one small, concrete symbol of everything in this house that Daniel no longer deserved. "I want to ask you something," I said to Daniel, "and I want an honest answer. Not the answer you think will make this easier, an honest one." He nodded carefully. "The house," I said. "Did you speak to anyone about the house? A solicitor, a financial advisor, anyone, before tonight?" He was very still. "Daniel, He stopped, looked briefly at his mother, then back at me. "I spoke to someone, yes, a solicitor, just to understand the situation, just to know where we stood." "To know where we stood," I repeated, "or to know where you stood?" Another silence. And there it was. That was the second crack in the floor, the one beneath the one I had already found. He had not only decided to end our marriage, he had already consulted a solicitor. He had already, in some quiet office I would never be shown into, begun the work of calculating what was his. Which meant he had been planning this, not just living his double life, but planning the exit from it, the tactical extraction, for some time before tonight. The dinner, the announcement, the public setting, None of it was impulsive. He had chosen the anniversary dinner deliberately. He had chosen the audience deliberately. And the timing, 4 months into the pregnancy, just visible enough to be undeniable, that had been deliberate too. He wanted it to look inevitable. He wanted me to feel as though the story had already been written, and my only remaining role was to absorb it gracefully and step aside. I felt something move through me in that moment. Not rage, not the hot, flooding kind that makes you say things you later regret. Something colder, something that settled along my spine like a long, thin blade. It was the feeling of a person who has just understood the actual dimensions of the thing arrayed against them, and who has chosen, very quietly, to rise to it. "All right," I said. I set down my wine glass. I stood up. "I think we're done for this evening." Daniel blinked. "Clara, we need to do nothing tonight," I said. "Tonight, I'm asking you all to leave. You," I looked at Gloria, "and you, at Petra, are welcome to stay in a hotel in the village. I'll call the Rose and Crown, they usually have rooms. Or you can drive back to wherever you came from. But you're not staying here." I looked at Daniel last. "Neither are you." He stared at me. "This is my house." I looked at him for a long moment. When I spoke, my voice was so quiet that Renata, who told me later she was barely breathing, said she had to lean forward to hear it. "Is it?" I said. I walked upstairs, knocked on Lily's door, and heard her say, "Come in." She was sitting on her bed in her blue dress, still with her hair pinned back, knees drawn up to her chest, her phone face down beside her. When I came in and sat on the edge of the bed, she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Good, I thought. Not because I wanted her to feel shame. She was 13, and her father had spent a year and a half making her complicit in something she was far too young to carry. But because her instinct to look away meant she knew, somewhere beneath everything, that what had happened tonight had not been right. "I'm not going to shout at you," I said. She nodded. "But I want you to understand something." I waited until she looked at me. "Whatever your dad told you about what's happening, whatever he asked you to keep quiet, whatever he explained it as, that was too much to ask of a child. And I'm not angry at you for being put in that position. I am furious that he put you there." I paused. "Do you understand the difference?" Her face crumpled just for a moment, and then she pulled it back together with the determined stoicism of a girl who has been trying very hard to be older than she is. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About 10 seconds longer than you think," I said. She almost smiled. I almost let myself. "Get some sleep," I said. I smoothed her hair back from her face. She let me, which told me more than she probably intended. Things are going to be very different for a while. But I promise you, they're going to be better. I kissed her forehead and went back downstairs. Daniel was still in the dining room, sitting in the candlelight in the ruins of our anniversary dinner. Gloria and Petra had apparently taken their coats and gone. I heard Renata's voice in the hall, the quiet, firm tone she used when she was managing something. And it was just us. Husband and wife, the two signatories of that poem on the little printed cards, still sitting at every empty place around the table. "In this life, I was loved by you." "The solicitor you spoke to," I said, standing in the doorway. "Were they family law?" He hesitated. "Yes." "Good," I said. "Then you'll understand when I say, I have a very good memory, Daniel, for dates, for documents, for the names on accounts and the details in contracts and the specific, legally relevant facts about who purchased what and when and with whose money." I held his gaze. "I suggest you sleep somewhere that isn't this house tonight, and I suggest that when your solicitor calls on Monday, you tell them to expect to hear from mine." He opened his mouth. "And Daniel," I turned to go, then paused, just once. "The next time you plan something like tonight, make sure the person you're planning it against isn't better at this than you are." I turned off the dining room light and left him sitting in the dark. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was crying, I wasn't, which surprised me more than anything else about those first hours. I lay in the center of our bed, on top of the covers, still in the burgundy dress, and I stared at the ceiling and I thought, methodically, carefully, the way I used to think before a big client presentation, when I would lay everything out in my mind like architectural drawings and examine each element for structural weakness. I thought about the house, about the accounts, about the consultancy, about the specific paperwork I had signed and not signed over 14 years of marriage, and the paperwork I had seen and not seen, and this was the part that kept pulling me back, the part with the cold, insistent gravity of a stone dropped into deep water. The paperwork I had never thought to look for because I had never imagined I would need to. I had been, I understood now, a woman who trusted. Not blindly, I was not naive, I had never thought of myself as naive, but fundamentally in the way that people trust who have not yet been given a sufficient reason not to. I had trusted Daniel with the financial architecture of our life because he was an architect, because he was organized, because early in our marriage he had demonstrated a talent for managing money that I was happy to defer to, because I had a business to run and a child to raise, and there are only so many hours in a day, and because, this was the one I kept coming back to, pressing on it like a bruise, because I had loved him. And when you love someone, you don't build trapdoors into the foundation. You just don't. He had known that about me. He had counted on it. By 4 a.m, I was at the desk in the small room off the landing that I used as a home office. I had changed into jeans and a sweater, made myself a strong coffee, and opened the filing cabinet in the corner, the one that held the household documents, insurance policies, mortgage papers, the accumulated administrative residue of a 14-year life. I had opened this cabinet hundreds of times. I had always found what I was looking for and closed it again without looking at anything else. Tonight, I pulled out every folder and began at the beginning. The first thing I noticed was the mortgage. We had remortgaged 3 years ago. I remembered it, vaguely, the way you remember administrative events that are handled efficiently and without drama. Daniel had told me the rate was better, that it made sense to consolidate, that he had spoken to our broker, and the paperwork was straightforward. I had signed where he put the tabs. I had not read every page. Who reads every page? I asked myself that now, alone in the quiet house at 4 a.m, and the answer was, people who have reason to, people who know to. I read every page now. The mortgage documents were in order, but on the 4th page of the refinancing agreement, in a section I had apparently signed without properly reading, there was a clause I did not remember discussing. A clause that named Daniel as the primary account holder for the purposes of any future sale or transfer of the property. Not sole owner, we were still joint owners, the deeds made that clear, but the designated decision maker in the event of a sale, whose signature alone could initiate the process. My signature would be required to complete the sale, but not to begin it, not to list it, not to accept an offer. I sat with that for a long time. Then I found the folder for our joint savings account. We had built it over years, modest contributions, steadily accumulated, the financial version of a slow and patient faith in the future. The balance, as of the last statement I had seen, which was dated 8 months ago, had been £47,000. I pulled out the most recent statement, which had arrived last month and which Daniel usually filed before I saw it. I had never questioned this. It was one of those small domestic divisions of labor that solidify, over years, into invisible walls. The most recent balance was £11,240. I set the statement down on the desk very carefully, the way you set down something fragile. Then I picked it up again and looked at the transaction history. Over the preceding 8 months, there had been a series of transfers, 14 of them, ranging from £1,000 to £4,000 each, to an account I did not recognize. The reference on each transfer was the same 2 words, project costs, £35,000, gone. Over 8 months in careful, measured installments that were individually unremarkable and collectively devastating. The kind of withdrawals that, if you were watching, would look like home improvement expenses or business costs. The kind that, if you were not watching, you would never notice at all. I had not been watching. I sat back in the chair. Outside, the first thin gray light was beginning to separate the sky from the tree line. The silver birch at the back of the garden emerged slowly from the darkness, pale and still. I watched it for a moment, and then I picked up my phone and typed a name into the search bar. Not Sophie's name. I didn't know her surname, and it felt beside the point. The name I typed was the name of a family law solicitor. Not just anyone, a specific one. Catherine Webb, who had an office in town and a reputation I had heard about from a client 2 years ago. A client who had gone through a particularly complex divorce involving a business and emerged 18 months later with everything that was rightfully hers. I had stored the name in the back of my mind without knowing why. Now I knew why. I sent an email at 4:47 in the morning. I apologized for the hour, gave my name and a brief summary of the situation, and asked for the earliest possible appointment. Then I put the phone down, gathered every document from the filing cabinet into a neat stack, and went downstairs to make a second cup of coffee. Renata was asleep in the guest room. She had refused to leave the night before, in the quiet, immovable way she had, not making a fuss of it, simply staying, and I was grateful in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Not because I needed company exactly, but because her presence in the house felt like a counterweight, something grounding. The world had tilted sharply, and she was ballast. I didn't wake her. I sat at the kitchen table with my documents and my coffee and the early morning silence, and I went through everything again. This time, I found something else. It was in a folder I had never opened, one of Daniel's, filed at the back of the cabinet, unmarked except for a small adhesive tab in the corner with nothing written on it. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a valuation of the house, dated 5 months ago. The second was a letter from an estate agency, a firm in the next town, not the one we had bought through, not anyone who knew us. Addressed to Daniel alone, setting out their terms of engagement for a residential sale. The third was a printed email exchange between Daniel and a man named Philip Hart, who identified himself in the signature as a property developer. I read the emails twice. The most recent one, sent 6 weeks ago, was from Daniel. It said, "Clara isn't aware of any of this, and I'd like to keep it that way until the timing is right. Once the divorce is initiated, I can move forward on the listing. She'll have no grounds to obstruct. The refinancing clause covers us. Let me know when you want to do a viewing." I put the emails down. I picked them up again. I read that last paragraph 4 more times. Clara isn't aware of any of this. That was my name. That was how my husband of 14 years had referred to me, in a private email to a property developer while planning to sell the home I had spent a decade building, using a legal mechanism he had concealed inside a remortgage I had signed without reading, while spending £35,000 of our shared savings on what I could only assume were the costs of establishing a new life with a 29-year-old woman named Sophie. That was when I cried. Not noisily, not the heaving, gulping kind of grief I had sometimes imagined, in idle moments, would accompany the end of my marriage. It was quiet. A few minutes, sitting at my kitchen table, with the dawn coming in through the window and the silver birch in the garden going slowly from gray to white. I let myself have it. I let it move through me like a wave, and when it passed, I wiped my face, straightened my spine, and took a very long, very steady breath. Then I photographed every document on my phone, uploaded them to a cloud folder I created with a new email address Daniel didn't know about, and went to shower and change before Renata woke up. She came downstairs at 7:30 to find me at the stove making eggs, the table set, the documents filed back in their cabinet, copies secured, originals replaced, everything exactly as Daniel had left it. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, reading my face. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No." "But you found something." I looked at her. "Sit down," I said. "I'll tell you while I make breakfast." I told her everything. She sat across the table from me and listened without interrupting. That was one of Renata's great gifts, the ability to truly listen without rushing toward her own response. And when I had finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The remortgage clause. Was that your solicitor who drafted that?" "It was Daniel's. He handled it. I just signed." She nodded slowly. "Catherine Webb," she said. It was not a question. I looked at her. "You know her?" "My cousin used her 3 years ago." Renata picked up her fork. "She is absolutely terrifying, in the best possible way." I felt, for the first time since the previous evening, something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Good," I said. "That's exactly what I need." Catherine Webb's assistant called at 9:15 that Monday morning. Catherine could see me Tuesday at 11. I said that would be perfect. I spent the rest of Sunday in the quiet architecture of my own house, cooking, cleaning, helping Lily with the homework she had been avoiding, walking to the end of the garden and standing for a long time under the oak tree. And I did not call Daniel. I did not answer the 2 messages he sent, which were brief and careful and conveyed the tone of a man who expected the situation to have softened overnight. I did not reply to Gloria's single text, which said only, "I hope you understand that this is for the best, for everyone." I read it, set my phone face down on the counter, and continued chopping vegetables for soup. Lily came into the kitchen at some point in the late afternoon and stood beside me, leaning against the counter in the way she always had since she was small, hip against the cabinet door, watching me work. "Is Dad coming back?" she asked. "Not to stay," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Did he call you?" "He texted." "Did you answer?" "Not yet." She picked up an apple from the bowl on the counter, turned it over in her hands. "He called me this morning," she said. "He said he hoped I understood, that it was complicated." I kept chopping. "What did you say?" "I said I did understand." She paused. "I lied. I don't understand at all." I set down the knife. I turned to look at her. This girl, this complicated, perceptive, imperfect, fiercely loved girl, and I felt the full weight of what had been taken from her by the adults in her life who should have known better. "You don't have to understand it right now," I said. "You just have to let me deal with it. Can you do that?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, put the apple back in the bowl, and went back upstairs. I stood there for a moment in the quiet kitchen, listening to her footsteps on the stairs, the familiar creak of the 3rd step from the top. Then I picked up my knife and went back to work. On Tuesday morning, I drove to Catherine Webb's office. It was a narrow Victorian terrace on the high street with a brass plate by the door and a waiting room that smelled of good coffee and fresh paper. Catherine herself was in her early 50s with cropped gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head and the kind of concentrated attention that made you feel immediately that your case was the only case in the world. She read through the documents I had brought, the full set, printed and annotated, without a word. When she finished, she took off her glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at me. "The remortgage clause," she said, "is legal, but it's narrow. It gives him the right to initiate a listing. It does not allow him to transfer ownership or complete a sale without your consent. Any buyer would need your signature." She paused. "He may not know that." "I think he believes he can force a sale," I said, "or pressure me into agreeing to one." "People often believe things that aren't quite true," she said pleasantly. "The savings transfers are more interesting. £35,000 to an unknown account over 8 months using joint funds." She tapped the statement. "If those funds were used to support the establishment of a separate household, rent, furniture, deposits, there's an argument for dissipation of marital assets. That's a serious matter in ancillary relief proceedings." I had spent 2 evenings learning what ancillary relief proceedings meant. I did not need her to explain. "What do we do first?" I said. Catherine smiled. It was a small, precise smile, the smile of a woman who has done this many times and enjoys it enormously. "First," she said, "we write him a letter." The letter went out on Wednesday. Catherine had drafted it herself in the measured, exact language of someone who knows precisely how much weight each word will carry in a courtroom. It was 3 pages long. It outlined, in careful sequence, the remortgage clause and its legal limitations, the £35,000 in transfers from the joint account, and the legal definition of dissipated marital assets, the undisclosed communications with Philip Hart regarding the property sale, and the specific legal consequences that would follow any attempt to list, value, or transfer the house without my full written consent. It also noted, in the final paragraph, that my solicitor had been retained and that all future communication regarding the divorce proceedings should be directed through her office. I did not see Daniel's face when he read it. I imagined it, though, several times. He called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. The message he left was 4 minutes long, and his voice moved through several registers in those 4 minutes. Conciliatory at first, then slightly aggrieved, then something that wanted to be reasonable but kept bumping up against the fact that reasonable was no longer a posture available to him. He said he hadn't meant for any of this to come out the way it did. He said he had wanted to handle it sensitively. He said the money transfers were for legitimate expenses and he could explain everything. He said he hoped we could approach this as adults. I listened to the voicemail twice, saved it to the same cloud folder as the documents, and did not call back. Gloria called the following morning. I answered that one, which surprised her. I could hear the brief, recalibrating pause before she spoke, the half-second of a woman who had prepared for a voicemail and suddenly has to perform live. "Clara," she said, "I think we need to talk." "I agree," I said. "Go ahead." Another pause. She had expected me to resist the conversation, to make her work for it. My willingness to engage directly had thrown her slightly off her script. I could almost feel her reshuffling. "I want you to know," she said, "that I never wanted this to hurt you." "But it did," I said pleasantly. "So that's rather beside the point, isn't it?" "Daniel is my son," she said, and there was the first note of something harder beneath the soft opening. "My first responsibility is to him. Surely you can understand that." "I can," I said. "And my first responsibility is to myself and to Lily. Surely you can understand that." A silence. "What is it you want, Claudia? Tell me honestly. What outcome are you hoping for here?" It was a strange question. Or rather, it was a question that revealed something about how Gloria had understood me all along, as a woman who wanted to be given things, soothed, accommodated, managed. A woman who could be asked what she wanted and would name something modest that could then be negotiated downward. "I want what's mine," I said. "All of it, including a fair account of what's been taken already." "No one has taken £35,000, Gloria." I kept my voice perfectly even. "From a joint account, over 8 months, while Daniel was telling me everything was fine." The silence this time was different, longer. "I'm sure there's an explanation," she said at last, but the confidence had gone out of her voice. She sounded, for the first time in 14 years, like a woman who is not entirely certain what her son has done. "I'm sure there is," I said. "I look forward to hearing it, in front of a judge, if necessary." I ended the call, stood in the kitchen for a moment, then I poured myself a glass of water, drank it standing at the sink, and went back to work. The consultancy had been mine long before Daniel and I married. I had built it from a single rented desk and a second-hand laptop into something that, by the time of our anniversary dinner, employed 3 people full-time and had a client list that included 2 boutique hotel groups, a national restaurant chain, and more private residential clients than I could comfortably handle alone. The business was in my name. The accounts were in my name. Daniel had never been a partner, never had any formal stake in it. This, I was beginning to understand, was one of the luckiest oversights of my life. Whatever else he had planned, whatever the exact dimensions of the financial trap he and his solicitor had been quietly constructing, the consultancy was outside it. But I needed to be sure. I called my accountant, a meticulous man named Gerald, who had handled the business accounts since year 3. I asked him to come in for a meeting and to bring everything, every filing, every return, every document relating to the business finances for the past 3 years. I told him it was for a personal legal matter and asked him to treat it in confidence. He arrived the following afternoon with 3 box files and the expression of a man who has seen this particular situation before and approaches it with professional sympathy. We spent 2 hours going through everything. The business was clean. Every account, every tax filing, every employee contract exactly as it should be. There was nothing Daniel could touch, nothing he had thought to reach for, possibly because he had been focused on the house and the savings account and had assumed, or hoped, that those would be enough. But there was one thing Gerald flagged, almost as an afterthought, as he was repacking the 3rd box file. "This payment here," he said, tapping a line on a printout, "from 18 months ago. Do you recognize it?" I looked. It was an invoice, paid from the business account, for £3,000. The payee was listed as DKS Consulting. The description was Strategic Advisory Services. I had never heard of DKS Consulting. I said so. Gerald frowned. "It was processed through your account. The authorization code is yours." I looked at the authorization code. It was a 6-digit number I had used as a PIN years ago, one of those auto-filled credentials that carry over from old systems and get forgotten. Daniel had known it. He had helped me set up the initial business banking back in the early days when the administrative setup had been chaotic and I had been grateful for the help. DKS. I turned the initials over in my mind. Daniel. Daniel Keith Spencer. His full name. "I need you to trace where that payment went," I said. Gerald looked at me steadily over the rims of his reading glasses. "I'll need access to the originating bank records." "I'll get you access," I said, "whatever you need." He nodded and packed up his boxes, and as I walked him to the door, he paused and said quietly, "For what it's worth, I've always thought the consultancy was entirely your achievement. I hope the legal process reflects that." I thanked him and closed the door and stood in the hallway of my studio above the florist shop, and I could smell the flowers from downstairs. Late-season roses, something sweet and green and living, and I pressed my back against the wall and closed my eyes for a moment. Just a moment, because the picture was becoming clearer now, and it was worse than I had initially calculated, and I needed to take that in before I could act on it. £3,000, 18 months ago. The exact month, I realized when I checked the date, that Daniel had started the affair with Sophie. DKS Consulting, his own initials, set up as a shell, drawing money from my business account using an old access code I had never thought to revoke. He had not only been stealing from our joint savings, he had been stealing from my business. I called Catherine from the car. "The picture is expanding," I told her. "Tell me," she said. I told her about Gerald, the invoice, the initials, the timing. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had the clipped, focused quality it got when something genuinely interested her. "If DKS Consulting is his entity, and the payment was unauthorized, that's potentially fraud," she said, "not just a civil matter. I want you to send me the invoice and the bank records as soon as Gerald has them. And Clara, I want you to stop communicating with Daniel directly. Anything you need to say it through me." "Understood. And one more thing." A brief pause. "Is there anyone in Daniel's professional circle, colleagues, former employees, anyone, who might have relevant information? Sometimes people know more than they've said, and a divorce proceeding has a way of loosening tongues." I thought of Marcus, the way he had paused in the kitchen doorway on the night of the dinner. For what it's worth, I had no idea. The careful specificity of that denial. Not, "I know nothing," but "I had no idea." As though there were things he did know, things that didn't fall within the category of whatever he was disclaiming. "There might be someone," I said. "Let me think about it." I thought about it for the rest of that week. I went about the ordinary business of my days. Client meetings, school runs, the quiet evening rituals that Lily and I were slowly rebuilding into a new shape. And in the background, I thought about Marcus, about what he might know, and why he had chosen those particular words on that particular evening, about whether he was the kind of person who, given the opportunity, would be willing to say what he knew. He called me on the Friday. I had not expected that. "I've been thinking about what to do," he said without preamble, "and I've decided that doing nothing isn't something I'm comfortable with." "What do you know?" I said. A long pause. "Daniel and I were working on a project together, a residential development. Private commission outside the firm. He told me it was a side venture, fully above board, that he was investing his own money." Another pause. "About 6 months ago, he asked me to review the financial structure of the project. I did. The investment figures he showed me didn't match what he had told me he was contributing. There was a discrepancy, a significant one. I asked him about it, and he gave me an explanation that I didn't fully believe, and then a week later, he asked me to step back from the project. I did. I should have pushed harder." "The project," I said slowly, "was it connected to a man named Philip Hart?" Silence. Then, "Yes." My hand tightened on the phone. The property developer. The email on Daniel's computer. Once the divorce is initiated, I can move forward on the listing. Not just planning to sell our house, using money from our joint savings, £35,000, as his investment contribution in a development project with Philip Hart, listed under the name DKS Consulting, seated with £3,000 taken from my business account to establish the entity, while simultaneously obtaining a legal opinion on the remortgage clause, preparing to list our home, and timing the announcement of his affair for maximum impact. This had not been a man having a midlife crisis. This had been a man executing a plan. "Marcus," I said carefully, "would you be willing to make a formal statement to a solicitor?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes, I should have said something sooner." "Can you come in next week? I'll give you Catherine Webb's details." He came in the following Tuesday. He sat with Catherine for 2 hours, and the statement he gave her was detailed, corroborated by emails he had kept, and damning. The financial discrepancy he had identified in the project accounts matched almost exactly the transfers from the joint savings account. Philip Hart's development project was not, as it turned out, a legitimate side venture. It was a mechanism, a way of moving marital assets into a private investment that, if the divorce had proceeded quietly and quickly as Daniel had planned, would have been almost impossible for my legal team to trace. Almost. Catherine called me after Marcus's meeting with a tone in her voice I had not heard before. It was not satisfaction exactly. She was too professional for that. It was something more precise. The tone of a person who has found exactly what they were looking for in exactly the place they expected to find it. "The picture is now complete," she said, "and it is not a flattering one for Daniel." "What happens next?" I said. "Next," she said, "we file. And then we let him understand, very clearly through proper legal channels, exactly what position he is in." "And the house? The listing?" "He will not be listing anything," she said. "Not this week, not any week in the foreseeable future. I'm seeking an injunction tomorrow morning." I sat with that for a moment. The house on Haverford Lane, with its sash windows and its garden and its farmhouse table and the oak tree at the back and the parquet floor I had stripped and polished myself. The house Daniel had decided, somewhere in the 18 months of his parallel life, was simply an asset to be liquidated, a line item in the financial plan of his new beginning. "Good," I said. "Thank you, Catherine." "Thank me later," she said, with the ghost of that small, precise smile that I could hear even over the phone. "We've only just started." The injunction was granted on Thursday morning. Catherine called me at 9:47, and I was standing in the studio above the florist's shop when she told me, watching the street below through the tall, narrow window, a delivery van pulling away, a woman with a pushchair, the ordinary machinery of a morning in a small town, and I felt something release in my chest. Not joy, not yet. Something closer to the sensation of a door being locked from the right side for the first time. The house could not be listed. It could not be valued by any agent acting on Daniel's instruction. It could not be touched. The injunction also froze the joint account pending the investigation into the transfers, which meant that whatever remained of the £11,000 was now protected. Daniel's solicitor filed a response within 48 hours. It was, Catherine told me with measured disdain, thin. The argument that the transfers represented legitimate business expenses fell apart almost immediately against Marcus's statement and the financial records Gerald had traced. DKS Consulting had been registered 8 months before the affair began, not 18 months, as I had initially calculated, but earlier. That detail was important. It meant the financial planning had preceded the affair itself, or at least had preceded Daniel's decision to disclose it. He had not, in other words, fallen in love and then panicked and started moving money. He had begun moving money and then, at some later point, decided the time was right to make his exit visible. I sat with that knowledge for several days. I turned it over. I examined it from different angles, the way you examine something you have found in a drawer and cannot immediately identify, trying to understand its shape, its purpose, the moment it had entered your life without your knowledge. The conclusion I kept arriving at was one I did not entirely want, but could not avoid. The man I had been married to for 14 years had been planning to leave for considerably longer than 18 months, and had spent that time not just conducting an affair, but constructing, with quiet architectural precision, a financial exit that would leave me with as little as possible. He had chosen the anniversary dinner not because it was cruel, or not only because it was cruel, but because the public announcement, the fait accompli, the visible fact of Sophie's pregnancy was designed to function as a kind of shock treatment, to knock me sideways long enough for the legal machinery he had already set in motion to advance unchallenged. He had expected grief. He had expected chaos. He had expected, I think, a woman too devastated to read the mortgage documents. He had not expected me. Lily came home from school on a Friday afternoon 3 weeks after the dinner and found me in the kitchen going over printouts with Gerald, who had stayed late to walk me through the final tracing of the DKS account. She dropped her bag by the door, looked at the papers spread across the farmhouse table, looked at Gerald, looked at me, and said, with the directness that had always been her most exhausting and most admirable quality, "Are you winning?" Gerald made a sound that was carefully not a laugh. "We're making progress," I said. "That means yes," she said, and went upstairs. Gerald left shortly after, and I stood in the kitchen in the early evening light and thought about Lily, about the girl who had sat at this table in her pale blue dress 3 weeks ago and laughed when her father announced he was leaving. I had not forgotten that laugh. I had not forgiven it either. Not yet, not entirely. But I had begun to understand it differently. She was 13. Her father had spent, I now believed, the better part of a year drawing her incrementally into his confidence, letting her feel special, letting her feel chosen, making her a keeper of his secret with the gradual, expert carelessness of someone who does not fully consider the cost of what they are asking. She had not laughed because she was cruel. She had laughed because she had been told this was good news, and she had believed him, the way children believe their parents even when they shouldn't. I was angry at Daniel for many things, for the money, for the planning, for the coldness of the execution. But the thing I was angriest about, the thing that sat lowest and hottest in me, that I had to work hardest to keep from showing, was what he had done to Lily. He had used her. He had taken her complicity as a tool and not considered, or not cared, what it would cost her when the tool was no longer needed. I called him that Friday evening. It was the first time I had initiated contact since the night of the dinner. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been waiting. "I want to meet," I said, "face to face, not at the house, neutral ground." A pause. "Clara, the coffee shop on Mill Street, tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Another pause. I could feel him calculating, weighing the request against whatever his solicitor had advised, trying to determine whether this was an ambush or an olive branch. "Fine," he said at last. 9 o'clock. I arrived early and chose a table at the back, away from the window. The coffee shop was quiet at that hour, a Saturday morning, most of the town still slow and domestic. A couple in the corner sharing a newspaper, a young woman working on a laptop, the smell of coffee and warm pastry, the ordinary comfort of a place with no particular associations. I ordered a flat white and waited. He came in at 9:01. He looked, I noticed with the detached clarity that had become my default mode, tired. The particular tiredness of a man who has been managing two lives simultaneously and is no longer quite managing either. He had lost some of the resolved composure that had characterized him on the night of the dinner. He looked, for the first time, like someone who understood the situation had not gone as planned. He sat down across from me, ordered a coffee he barely touched, and said, "I suppose your solicitor knows you're here." "Of course," I said. "I'm not hiding anything." He looked at me for a long moment. "What do you want to talk about?" "Lily," I said. He hadn't expected that. I watched it move through his face, the preparation for a legal conversation suddenly reconfigured. "What about Lily?" "She is 13 years old," I said. "She is not a participant in our divorce proceedings. She is not a messenger. She is not a confidant. She is not a symbol of anyone's position. Whatever you have said to her about this situation, whatever you have asked her to understand or accept or keep quiet about, it needs to stop. She needs to be allowed to be a child who is going through a difficult time, not an adult who has been recruited to a side." He was quiet for a moment. "I never tried to. She knew about Sophie before the dinner," I said. "She knew, and she kept it from me, because somewhere in the preceding months, you had allowed her to absorb the idea that your new life was something to be celebrated. She laughed, Daniel, at the dinner table when you announced it." I held his gaze. "I want you to understand what that cost her, what it is still costing her. She came home the other day and didn't have lunch with any of her friends because one of them had heard from her mother, who apparently knows someone who knows Sophie, and Lily didn't know what to say." I paused. "She is 13. She is handling your choices, and you need to make that right with her, directly, clearly, without asking her to protect your feelings in the process." He said nothing for a long time. And then something happened that I had not expected and was not, in the honest privacy of my own reaction, entirely prepared for. His face changed. The careful composure, the legal caution, the defensive posture of a man who has been in a solicitor's office too many times recently, all of it went. What was underneath was someone who looked, for a moment, genuinely wretched. "I know," he said quietly. "I know what I did to her. I think about it every day." I believed him. That was the complication of knowing someone for 14 years. You could tell, most of the time, when they were being honest. And this was honest. It didn't change anything. It didn't undo the documents or the money or the planning or the dinner. But it was honest. "Then do something about it," I said. "Whatever else is happening between us legally, and there is a great deal happening, as I suspect you now know, Lily is separate. She needs her father to show up for her as a father, not as a man who is managing a narrative." He nodded, once, slowly. I stood up. I had said what I came to say. "Catherine will be in touch about the schedule," I said. "I expect this to be handled efficiently and without drama. The faster it's resolved, the better for everyone, including Sophie and the baby, who have done nothing wrong." He looked up at that. I thought I saw something cross his face. Surprise, maybe, or something like gratitude. But I was already turning away, and I didn't look back to confirm it. I walked out into the morning air, cool and clear with the smell of early autumn, and I stood on the pavement for a moment and let myself breathe. The proceedings moved with a speed that Catherine attributed partly to the strength of the evidence and partly to the fact that Daniel's solicitor, faced with the fraud implications of the DKS account, had advised him strongly against prolonged contention. The £35,000 was returned to the joint estate and factored into the financial settlement. The DKS company was dissolved. The $3,000 from my business account was returned with interest. The house remained mine. bought out from the joint estate at a valuation that Catherine negotiated with the focused implacability of someone who does this for a living and genuinely enjoys it. I paid Daniel his share of the equity from a mortgage on the consultancy, which I could service comfortably, and which left me the sole owner of the Victorian house on Haverford Lane, with its sash windows and its farmhouse table and its garden and the oak tree and the silver birch and the path I had walked with Lily on Sunday mornings when she was small. Philip Hart's development project, it emerged during the financial disclosure process, had already attracted the attention of a regulatory body for reasons unrelated to Daniel, something involving planning permissions and undisclosed investors. The investigation meant that any funds connected to the project were frozen, pending review. Daniel's investment through DKS, the bulk of the $35,000, was tied up in that freeze for the better part of a year. He received it eventually, reduced by legal fees, much later than he had planned. Gloria called me once more, about 6 weeks before the settlement was finalized. I answered, as I always did, because I had nothing to hide and no reason to avoid her. "I want you to know," she said, "that what Daniel did, the financial matters, I wasn't aware of all of it." "I know," I said, and I did know. Not because I absolved her. The 18 months of kept secrets, the Christmas question about renewing vows, the bright, triumphant eyes at the dinner table, none of that was absolved. But I believed she had not known the full scope of it. She had known about Sophie. She had known about the divorce. She had not known about DKS or Philip Hart or the remortgage clause or the systematic transfer of funds. Those were Daniel's architecture alone. "I'm sorry," she said. It was simple and unadorned, and I thought it was probably the most honest thing she had ever said to me. "Take care of yourself, Gloria," I said, and ended the call. The settlement was signed on a Tuesday morning in Catherine's office. I wore the gray blazer I bought for important meetings, the one that makes me feel, when I put it on, like a version of myself who is entirely ready for whatever is next. Catherine pushed the papers across the desk, and I signed where she indicated, and when it was done, she looked at me over her glasses with that small, precise smile. "Congratulations," she said. Or rather, welcome to the next part. I laughed, a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere low and genuine. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." "Don't thank me," she said. "You did the work. I just carried the paperwork." I drove home along the familiar road, through the village, past the florist shop where my studio sat above the window boxes, past the coffee shop on Mill Street, where I had sat across from Daniel for the last, difficult, honest conversation we would ever have, and up Haverford Lane to the cream-colored Victorian with its tall windows catching the autumn light. I parked in the drive and sat in the car for a moment. The house looked exactly as it always had. The same cream render, slightly warm in the afternoon sun, the same sash windows, the same front garden with the last of the season's roses, gone slightly blousy now, dropping petals onto the path. I had stripped those floors and chosen those windows and planted those roses and carried that farmhouse table home on the roof of the car, laughing while Daniel said it wouldn't fit. It fit. I got out of the car and stood in the drive and tilted my face up to the sky, which was pale blue and very clear, and I breathed in the smell of the autumn air and the late roses and the damp gravel and the cold coming. And I thought, this is mine. Not defiantly, not triumphantly, just quietly, completely, as a statement of fact. This is mine. Lily was home when I came inside. She was in the kitchen doing homework at the farmhouse table, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, a half-eaten piece of toast beside her notebook. She looked up when I came in. I set my bag down on the counter, loosened my blazer, filled the kettle. "How did it go?" she asked. "It's done," I said. She looked at me for a moment with those eyes that had always seen too much for her own good, and then she nodded, slow and certain, as though she had never doubted it. "Good," she said, and went back to her homework. I made 2 cups of tea and set one beside her notebook without a word, and then I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the garden. The oak at the left, the silver birch in the middle, the path to the woodland gone quiet and gold in the late afternoon. The world exactly as it was. Me, different. Some things, when they break, don't need to be rebuilt into the same shape. Some things break because the shape was always wrong, and what comes after, quieter, cleaner, entirely your own, is what was supposed to be there all along. I picked up my tea. Outside, the silver birch moved in the wind, pale and unhurried, the way it always had. I drank my tea and watched it, and I was fine.